Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Earthly Headlines. Meant to get one out sooner for the holiday weekend, but just didn't get around to it. You know, life happens. But anyway, I want to talk about climate change in the age of the Indus Valley Civilization. If you guys don't know about the Indus Valley Civilization, in northwestern India, there's this thing called the Indus River, and people settled around there. Much like in China, there was the Yellow River, and people settled around the Yellow River. Well, this is kind of the same idea, except this civilization no one knew about it for a long time until about, I think, the 1920s. Someone discovered it, and since then it's been a mystery that has kind of been, people have been peeling the layers away little by little. And I mean, they date back to around 5,000 BC, 4,000 BC, and they've been around for a long time. This new study that is kind of, like I said, peeling back these layers. These climatologists are studying what the climate was like back then, and they found out that there was a drastic change in the climate that drove them away from their bread and butter, basically, living off this river, because they banked on it flooding every there was a flood season that they could rely on, and that's why the civilization got as successful as it was, is because this flood kept coming. When the climate changed, it threw everybody through a loop, and people they spread out, and some people went to the mountains and the Himalayas, some people went to the Middle East, some people went south. But as you can see from this map, most of the big settlements are along this river here. So when we're talking about Indus Valley Civilization, we're talking about a really, really advanced population of people. Not only did they have sophisticated cities, they had sewage systems that are way older than the Romans. They had long distance trade with Mesopotamia. This kind of reminds you of other civilizations that I've talked about in the past, like the Minoans. The Minoans were very similar. They were advanced. They predated the Romans, and they had long distance trade as well. So it would be really interesting to see if they had any cultural exchange between this civilization and the other one, and the Minoans. But anyway, a funny thing happened a few thousand years into their civilization, the Indus Valley Civilization. Around 1800 BC, they started leaving their cities in droves. They started establishing smaller villages, and in this, they're looking at the climate change that drove what they call the Harappans to go away from the floodplains, right? So this is peculiar, right? Why would people leave the floodplains? So around 2500 BC, there was a sudden shift in temperatures and weather patterns. So the monsoon season that happened in the summer that would flood the rivers, it started to come less and less frequently. It started to dry up, and then it made it difficult to grow anything around the riverbank, especially in the Harappan cities, which are in the northeastern part of the Indus Valley Civilization that we know of. I mean, this map right here is what we know of the Indus Valley Civilization, but it could very well have been bigger than this, just to keep that in mind. The climatologists came up with this idea that when the monsoons started to dry up, the moisture would come more regularly toward the foothills. It would make sense then that the people would follow where the moisture is. And so with this hint, they started to dig, and they found out that the winter storms from the Mediterranean, they hit the Himalayas, and then they created rain on the eastern part, or the Pakistan, what's now Pakistan, that side of their civilization. And there were little streams there that they could set up shop in and start growing stuff. It definitely wasn't as much water as the Indus Valley or the Indus River would have, but it was something that was worth packing up and leaving for. I mean, let's say you were living on a farm and you were living off the riverbank for, let's say, a couple generations, like your grandfather taught your father, and then your father would teach you. Once that dried up, even though your family had been there for generations, they still would pack up and leave. That's how dry it was, basically. That's how desperate times got. And they can tell this all from the climate. So there's one issue, though. So the evidence for the shift in the seasonal rainfall was pretty difficult to find in soil samples. So what they instead did, they focused on the sediments from the ocean floor off of Pakistan's coast. So they took core samples at these sites in the Arabian Sea, and then they examined single-celled plankton. I mean, this is getting pretty deep, right? They call them foraminifera. They found these in the sediments, and then which helped them understand which ones were living during the summer and which ones were thriving in the winter. So once they identified that based on their fossil remains, then they focused on even deeper clues. So they looked at DNA, which fragments of ancient genetic material in the sediments, and they found out that the seafloor near the mouth of the Indus River was very low oxygen. So whatever grows and dies in the water is very well preserved in the sediment. So that's how they were able to find these things. So using this technique, they're able to get fragments of DNA of pretty much anything that's lived and died in the sediment. So right away, they have like this of data that they can tap into. Some conclusions they drew were during the winter monsoons, there were strong winds bringing nutrients from the deeper part of the ocean back up to the surface in this kind of cycle, and then there would be a surge in plant and animal life, right? Because everything's brought to the surface. So that's how they could tell if there was an influx of these nutrients. They could tell that, then that means the winds were strong. And then when they were weaker, there would be fewer nutrients, essentially. So fewer nutrients means less productivity, less activity, and less opportunity, essentially. So using that as a measuring stick, they are able to extrapolate that with the climate data, and they were able to paint a picture of the biodiversity of that time and place in history without really finding any skeletal remains or relying on fossils. So this is actually a really interesting way they come up with a date. Now, is it set in stone? Is it foolproof? Absolutely not, But it's good to have this in the books, so when the day comes when they do find some sort of other type of evidence from a different source, they can compare the two, and then you can kind of come up with a clearer date from there. Taken from the article, it gives a very high resolution picture of how the ecosystem changed over time. So from there, using that DNA evidence, they found that the winter monsoons seemed to become stronger and the summer monsoons weaker. So they had this inversion of weather toward the later years of their civilization. So this spelled the beginning of the end for the civilization, essentially, because what made them a powerful civilization were these floodplains, were these floods of the river. And then once that started drying up, then they had to adjust. And what the climatologists here are identifying is this attempted adjustment to moving toward the foothills, because they're basically trying to get moisture so they can grow stuff. It's very similar to what happened in the Green Sahara. When the Green Sahara started to become a desert, when desertification was happening, people were just following the game animals, and the game animals, they follow the plants wherever the pastures are. And then when stuff dries up, you slowly, if there was a graphic, you can kind of see the brown spreading, or the dirt spreading, and then the plant life receding. So this is very similar to what was going on, except in this case they're following the moisture because they wanted to grow whatever it is they were growing. And then their established culture and their urban way of life, because they had these elaborate cities with sewage systems, so they were these were permanent settlements. It just totally flipped their way of life upside down. And that was, again, the end of their civilization, which kind of explains why they just were forgotten after a while. When in the 1920s, when they discovered the Indus Valley Civilization, they had no idea what it was. Even the people living there had no idea, who were occupying that space like thousands of years after the fact. It kind of goes without saying that the foothill rains it wasn't enough to get them by to recover as a civilization, because eventually that dried up, and their whole civilization just collapsed after that. By the way, the scientist's name is Giosan. So Giosan says that we can't rule we can't say for sure that climate was a deciding factor, although it definitely played a critical role in the dissolution of their civilization. At around the same time, the Indo-Aryan culture was arriving in the region as well, and they brought Iron Age tools, they brought horses, they brought carts, and it kind of it definitely changed the way their society is working as well. So there was like a cultural factor in this collapse as well. And then part of the reason things started drying up was because there was a new ice age coming in. When we say the ice age, we mean like when we say, oh, we came out of the ice age, that marks the beginning of the Holocene and the end of the Pleistocene. But in between the beginning of the Holocene, which is about 12,000 plus years ago, there have been these series of anomaly, or what is called anomalies, but I think they're more of patterns of these little ice ages coming and going. So the last one, the last little ice age we had, I think ended in the mid 1800s. And so now we're kind of enjoying this medieval warm period that we have, which is similar. Well, medieval warm was the last warming period before the little ice age. So we're kind of in that little climate window right now. So Randall Carlson says that what we should be worried about is global cooling and not global warming, because global warming is very few and far between if you look at the history of the Earth's climate. So in this case, after thousands of years of being a successful civilization, when this new ice age came, everything started drying up. So all the colder air from the Arctic went into the Atlantic and Northern Europe, and then that pushed it pushed all the storms down into the Mediterranean, and then that's why there were winter monsoons instead of the summer monsoons. So basically it's this huge climate domino effect that eventually knocked over the Harappan civilization, the ancient Harappans. So it's very interesting, because here's a graphic here. Here's a better graphic than this other one I was showing you. This is the Harappan the Indus Valley Civilization toward the end of their history, and you can see that this is the Indus River right here, like Mohenjo-Daro. You have all these prominent cities, and people start moving toward these foothills here to kind of chase the water, so to speak. And so this is interesting, as I was saying, because you can kind of see their attempts, or the climate is indicative of their attempts to survive as a civilization. And they're clinging on to this moisture, and then eventually you have this cultural interference, and then political and social upheaval, and then next thing you know, you have one civilization dying and another one coming up in its ashes, and eventually becomes forgotten until, of course, 1920. Which, by the way, is a huge discovery. Just the story of the Indus Valley Civilization and how it was found just like 90 plus years ago, 95 years ago. So there's still a lot we don't know about this civilization, and feel free to let me know what you think in the comments. If you guys have anything to add about this civilization, they're really old, and some people think that it's a lot older than the dates say. So right now, I think the oldest someone's willing to say, it goes back 5,500 BC. So around 7,000 years ago almost. And they had plumbing, or they had a sewage system back then. So yeah, who knows how much older it is. So let me know what you guys think in the comments, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. I'll have a video out tomorrow.